And this is the tomb of Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond, better known as My Lady the King's mother. Very fierce and courageous woman. Some say ruthless, but the ultimate example of a mother's love. So this is where I wanted to begin our documentary with this lady. There are no pictures or portraits of Margaret from her own time when she was alive, just posthumous ones. But this is believed to be made from a death mask. So this is the closest you'll ever get to seeing the true face of My Lady the King's mother.
And here she is, My Lady the King's mother, on the 515th anniversary of her death. She died late in the night, 515 years ago, on this very night, on the 29th of June, 1509, aged 66, at the Abbot's lodgings at Westminster Abbey. Lady Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond and Derby, most commonly remembered as My Lady the King's mother, a descendant through a bastardised line of King Edward III. Lady Margaret passed this disputed claim to the English throne to her son, King Henry VII, as he would become. She was born on the 31st of May 1443 at Bletsoe Castle, Bedfordshire. And here we see the much changed Bletsoe Castle in this 17th century engraving. It would have been much more castle-like when she was born. The Wars of the Roses and the upcoming as that would be. It was a very warlike era and people lived in much more castle-like structures in those days. Of course, after the Wars of the Roses and peace came, many of these castles were turned into the country houses that we see today. And here is what you will see of Bletsoe Castle today if you go there. Margaret's father was John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset. And for any of you ladies and gents that have read or watched the Red Queen or the White Queen, her father did indeed take his own life, and her mother did indeed have to pull all manner of strings and tricks and bribes to get the man buried as a Christian. Because don't forget, in those days, to take your life not only brought shame on your family, but it denied you, so the church believed and taught, entry to heaven, and denied you burial in a consecrated place. But through the trickery of her mother, buried in a consecrated place he was. And Lady Margaret's mother was Margaret Beaufort of Bletsoe, and here you see her parents' tomb in Wimborne Minster in Dorset. Now the marriages of Lady Margaret Beaufort, My Lady the King's mother, which, like for most aristocratic young ladies in those days, began very, very young. At the age of 7, she was betrothed, not married in the sense that we think of it, but betrothed to John de la Pole, 2nd Duke of Suffolk. They were betrothed in 1450, and it was annulled in 1453 because a much better marriage came along, who I've marked with the blue arrow here. Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. He was half-brother to the Mad King, King Henry VI, who was murdered at the Tower of London. And they married in 1455. Now, Margaret, when she married, she was 12 and he was in his 20s. He died just 1 year later of the plague. This was during the early onset of the Wars of the Roses. So, at that very young age, Margaret was a heavily pregnant widow, and at the age of 13 she was a mother by that time. The labour of which her only child, the future King Henry VII, is known to have been an extremely traumatic labour on her body, being so young and always being a very small woman. It's believed that the trauma of this labour damaged her internally because she never conceived another child again, although she did, as you can see from here, marry again after Edmund Tudor. Here you see Edmund Tudor's funeral effigy or monument effigy. And Margaret, after his death, would marry to Sir Henry Stafford, in 1458. A happy marriage, as it's known and recorded. He died in 1471. When I say a happy marriage, I mean a marriage in every sense of the word, and carnally as well. To try and keep this nice for YouTube. And after his death, she married Sir Thomas Stanley, 1st Earl of Derby. A loveless marriage, but one of the most important ones in Margaret's life, because Sir Thomas Stanley, as we will find out at the Battle of Bosworth Field, he was imperative to Margaret's son actually becoming king, and they married in 1472 and he died in 1504. But from her Tudor marriage would come Margaret's greatest work, her greatest task in life. Henry, her only child, who would become Henry VII. When I described her as the ultimate symbol of a mother's love, I did mean that. She loved this child so ardently that she would do anything to keep him safe and to get him to the throne. Anything. She could be known to be an extremely generous and kind lady, but if you went against her family, she would destroy you. And the Wars of the Roses between the houses of York and Lancaster were fought between 1455 and 1487 on and off. And they would culminate really in the Battle of Bosworth Field and the death of King Richard III on the 22nd of August 1485. And remember I said about Margaret's last husband, Stanley, how important he was. He was supposed to be on the side of Richard III. Stanley had stood side on battles before and waited to see which way it was going and then gone on the winning side. But being married to Margaret, Stanley stood aside, even though his own son was being held hostage by Richard. And he waited until the right moment, and then he rode his troops into battle against his king, Richard. And Richard was killed, and King Henry VII became king. Henry Tudor. And so began the Tudor dynasty. One of the first things Henry Tudor did was to marry Elizabeth of York, the daughter of King Edward and the niece of King Richard III. He did this to so further legitimise his reign and his line, and also because Elizabeth's father was a very much loved king, so it was another reason to marry his daughter to further legitimise and get in with the people, really. And so began the reign of King Henry VII, Elizabeth of York, and of course my lady the king's mother, because we must remember in that marriage there were three people, not just the husband and the wife, but Margaret Beaufort here, my lady the king's mother, or as Dr. David Starkey describes her, the mother-in-law from hell. She, as I say, there were three people in that marriage, and we're looking at the third party. Margaret Beaufort loved her son ardently and stayed with him all her life, all his life. Where he went, she could often be found. At the court, he regarded her very highly because of how hard she'd fought to get him where he was, and also because he really did respect her opinion as a very well-educated and very powerful woman. Many of the decisions that were made by Henry VII came from the mind of this lady, my lady the king's mother. And of course, from that marriage would come the Tudor dynasty, as many of us know about it, but sadly for Margaret, in April 1509, the loss of her beloved son, her only child, all she'd fought for, it destroyed Margaret, and she ailed from that very moment onwards, and she died just 2 months after her own son. She lived long enough, however, to see the coming in of the next reign and line of the Tudors, her grandson, King Henry VIII, and we see a young King Henry here, a portrait in 1509 by Maynard Warwick. And of course, Margaret sadly died before she could see the next phase of the Tudor line, going from Henry VIII to his children, King Edward VI, Queen Mary I, and the last and probably most famous Tudor of all, Queen Elizabeth I. The devastated Margaret lasted only 2 months after her son. You lose a child, your only child, who you fought everything for, at the age of nearly 70 as well. You can well imagine what that did to the woman. And on a slightly less sadder note, and a slightly more surreptitious note, here you see the prayer book of Lady Margaret Beaufort. Before we leave her behind, this is what I wanted to show you. It's a very, very quick video snippet and picture. It's in the upper galleries of Westminster Abbey, and you're not really supposed to take pictures or videos there, because in other parts of it there are certain things that they would definitely not want videoed. But I was slightly naughty and videoed her prayer book. Lady Margaret Beaufort's prayer book, dating from around 1500, by the Master of the Dark Eyes, who's done the illuminating and the writing, and he was active in around the year 1500 as well. This Latin prayer book, written by hand, belonged to King Henry VII's deeply religious mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Collections of private prayers were often simpler versions of the service books used by monks and nuns, but included other prayers chosen by the owner. These books they usually belonged to very wealthy individuals indeed, who wished to pray at home as well as in church. It's all hand illuminated and written in ink on vellum, which is calf skin, and bound in velvet with silver gilt clasps. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my lady the King's mother, a very powerful woman, an ultimate symbol of a mother's love, and some modern day historians think possibly the murderess of the princes in the tower, but that's another story for another time, and a real matter for conjecture until those DNA tests are done. So, I hope you all found this interesting. If you did, please give it a like and a share, as it helps the page, and thank you very much.